Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new, welcome to my channel. My name is Stephanie Yates. I am Steph Anya for short, and I'm a licensed associate marriage and family therapist. And today's video are for my fellow therapists and those who are in the process of becoming therapists. We'll be talking about therapy notes. If you're curious or interested, stay tuned. Okay, so after I did the day in the life of a therapist, that was my first time ever doing that. I mentioned in that video that I take my notes during the session, and surprisingly a lot of people were following up asking what do I include in my therapy notes in general, and I thought that that would actually be a really good topic because the way I take my notes now is very different from how I took my notes when I first started, and so I just wanted to go through a little bit about my note-taking journey, as well as sharing some of the things that I always include as well as things that I avoid when I'm taking my notes. Now, disclaimer, this is for a regular session. If we're talking about something where there is a reason where you need to break confidentiality, that's going to be a completely different type of note-taking process, but this is just for your standard session, and this is also not an intake session where it's the first time you're meeting the client and you're gathering a lot of introductory information about them. This is for a standard follow-up continuing therapy session note. So when I first started out taking notes, I used to be way too detailed. Back in college, I actually used to be paid to take notes in classes for people who had difficulty with note taking. And so what I started doing, write everything out. And so I was pretty much using the same approach when I became a therapist. So what my process used to be is I would handwrite my notes. They would be so detailed, and then it would take me forever to try to fill in the gaps of where I couldn't handwrite everything and type it all up. So my process used to be really overwhelming, and I remember talking to my supervisor about it, and he was like, why aren't you taking your notes in session? And I'm like, I am taking my notes in session because I was handwriting them. He's like, no, why aren't you typing them up during the session so you don't have to worry about doing that after the session? That was the first major change. The difference between now and when I first started is that now I take my notes during the session. And the question that a lot of you were asking is, okay, so what are you writing down when you're doing those notes? And so I'm going to go through firstly what I always include in my notes, and also some things that I avoid when I'm writing my notes. So as a marriage and family therapist, the first thing I always include in my notes, I'll call it relational factors. I basically am curious if you are in a relationship, how are things going? If we've been talking about you maybe reconnecting with a father you haven't been in touch with, are we any closer to doing that? If you talk about you and your roommate constantly getting into fights, have you guys resolved that? What are your communication skills looking like? So the emphasis in my sessions is always going to be that relational piece. So my sessions end up being 90% about the relational factors, talking about relationships past, present, hopes for the future with relationships. That is usually the focus of my sessions. So whereas another therapist might not find those things as important, like, you know, you're bickering with your roommate, for me that's extremely important and very revealing about how the client views themselves as well as what's possible for them with relationships. As a marriage and family therapist, I feel like connection is the most important thing that we can work on, and a lot of times it boils down to improving communication skills, addressing anger management issues, where we can help you move past the problems that have historically gotten in the way of you having healthy and thriving relationships. Then the next thing that I'll talk about, and a lot of times it's related, are current stressors. You always want to think about what are new stressors or continuous stressors that the client is experiencing. So if I have a client, for example, that right now their goal is to lose weight and they're feeling really frustrated about not being able to do that, I will definitely write in my note, current stress includes weight loss. Those kind of things that let me know, like, what are the main problems? Because when I have clients for 2 years plus and I look back at their earlier notes, it's good for me to know what the current stressors were at that time, like being unemployed, for example, versus what they look like now, because that's a great way to be able to measure progress, is when I say, well, remember when your biggest problem was X and now we don't even talk about that anymore? That is very important for building hope and helping the client view their current stressors as more manageable when they can remember that there have been other stressors that they have successfully worked through. Symptoms. So we could be talking about somatic symptoms, like maybe you have a lot of headaches or stomach aches. In those cases, I'm probably going to refer the client to a doctor, probably to their general practitioner, and that is something I would definitely note if I make any referrals. And we might be talking about symptoms like anxiety or depression. If it's something that is really persisting and getting in the way of their daily functioning, then I might refer them to a nurse practitioner or a psychiatrist to see about medication. Those symptoms let me know what we can address successfully in therapy, or things that we need to kind of incorporate a team to help address. To me, the purpose of therapy is to get to the root of those issues and stop the symptoms, right? But the symptoms can be overwhelming enough that they get in the way of us properly addressing the root. So if you're so anxious, for example, that you're having a hard time getting out of bed and you're so nervous that you're not making it to your sessions, then that's going to be an indication that you need to address those anxiety symptoms before we can really get to the root of the issue, because you're not making it to your sessions due to this anxiety. And that's an example of when I would say, let's address the symptoms first, and then we can start really working through the root of what is causing those symptoms. Another really important thing for me to include in my notes is coping strategies, particularly effective coping strategies. I have had a client that told me I was really tempted to yell, but what I did instead was go into the closet and cry. Actually, I think I've had 2 or 3 clients tell me that just in the last 2 weeks. So they found an effective coping method because when they walked out the closet, they felt a lot better. In all 3 of those cases, different relational issues, they were able to find a safe space in their closet, work through their emotions. And it seems bizarre, you might say, ooh, that's an issue, but I just look at that as an effective coping strategy. So whatever is working for them, if they say, oh my gosh, I went on a run the other day, I felt so much better after running, or I caught my mom up and it was really good to talk to her, I feel so much better after talking to her. I'm always keeping track of those things, because a lot of times when we're feeling low, you know, our memory can be short, or we're not really actively thinking about how can I make myself better. And as a therapist, it's my job to remember those things. I view my job as saying, you know, well, I remember that, you know, going rock climbing was something that was really helpful for you in the past. Do you think that could be useful in this situation? And most of the time they're like, I don't know, it could be. That did help before and they weren't thinking about it. So effective coping strategies are really good to put down. And then also maladaptive coping strategies. So if my client says, well, you know, I just went and got blackout drunk, that helped me. You know, that could be okay depending on the situation, but if they're tending to do that when they're out in public, end up drunk driving, or end up getting blackout drunk and doing a lot of things that they regret, then in that situation, I'm going to probably suggest that we try to do some other coping strategies that have less adversive side effects or consequences. So coping strategies is something that I'm always going to be listening in for when I'm taking my notes. Mental status. So a lot of health management systems will require you to do a mental status exam or check for every session. My last system that I used required that, and the current one does not, but I still will include some of those things. So if your client is particularly fidgety that day, for example, it'd be good to mention that, you know, they seem to be a little bit more physically agitated than typical. How did they dress? You know, do they normally come in like a business suit, but then today they came in like pajamas and slippers? Do they come in with shades on today? Some of those things can be very relevant, especially if there are changes from what you usually see from the client. And I'll usually only include that information if it is something drastically different or concerning. You know, if they kept forgetting what day it was or the time, those are different things that I will definitely include with the mental status exam. But if the client seems to be pretty normal, I'm probably not going to include that in my notes if it doesn't help me understand where they were at that point in time for the session. If it's just normal, it's probably a waste of space for me, especially if it's not required in my note taking, which, like I said, in this current system I'm in, it's not required. Another thing that I always make sure to include in my notes are the interventions. Interventions could be talk therapy, or you could list out the homework or specific questions that you asked that day. What did you do? How did you guide that session so that it could be useful and productive for the client? That's what interventions are. Now, here are the things that I avoid when I do my notes. Full names of people they talk about, or names at all. If possible, if I can just say their son, their partner, their boss, I will do that. When I first started out, I used to write people's names in the notes because it helped me feel like, okay, I can remember the people's names better if I type it out and see it in my notes. It makes them know that I'm listening. But in actuality, when you think about these notes, always think about the fact that your notes at some point, you could get a subpoena for them. If they are for some reason compromised or obtained, you still want to be able to protect your client as best as you can. And so I try my best not to put information in there that could really hurt my client if it were discovered. So you want to think of it that way. You want your notes to be detailed enough where you can go back and see, okay, this is what they were dealing with at that point in time, but you don't want it to be so detailed that if another person saw it, it could be possibly like incriminating for that client or very embarrassing for them. Gruesome or graphic details. If I have a client, for example, that's opening up to me about some sort of childhood or sexual trauma, for example, I'm not going to list out in detail, first he lifted the skirt. Like, that's inappropriate and unnecessary in notes. I'll just actually say under the interventions that I used, I might say we unpacked past childhood trauma, but I'm not going to go into detail about what, who, when, where with the trauma unless it's absolutely necessary for me understanding the relevance it takes in the session. Moral judgments. So you might notice earlier when I was talking about coping skills, I mentioned getting blackout drunk could be okay. Now, theoretically, people are gonna look at that and say, why would you ever say it's okay for your client to become blackout drunk? But when you really think about it, that's a moral judgment. It's really not my place to tell my client what is and is not appropriate or healthy in their life, because culturally, we could be dealing with very different versions of what healthy looks like. And I don't take it as my responsibility to tell them what is right and what is wrong. Now, I can go based on what they are telling me. If you're telling me, okay, I got blackout drunk, but I ended up hitting my friend's car, I called up an ex that I promised myself I'd never talk to, then I can say, well, it sounds like what ended up happening that night is not in alignment with the growth and progress you're trying to see and a lot of the efforts that you've already made. And most of the time the clients will just agree with you, like, yeah, you're right, that's not really what I want to be doing. We're like, okay, well, let's talk about some other strategies for dealing with this stress instead of drinking. And so when I talk about moral judgments, you don't want to say client being irresponsible. Those are judgments. You just want to state the facts. Client is late on bills and gambling. The client can give you that information. They can say, oh shoot, I'm gonna be late on my bills this month. And you ask, well, what happened with the money? I know you just got a new job. And they say, well, unfortunately, I went to Vegas and gambled it all away. But that's actually a problem that my grandmother had. So now we start seeing some of that generational stuff. And that is something that I would include. Client says that gambling is a multi-generational problem within the family. Those kind of things that I will always take into consideration as the symptom and the family dynamic. How do they align? And then lastly, I don't want to put any revealing or identifying information if possible. Now, most health management recording systems are going to use a code for the client and not the client's full name associated with the note. So I don't want to, if that note is somehow obtained, I don't want to make it obvious like, oh, client has heart-shaped birthmark. They mentioned that to me, or something that would make it clear who it is or make it where they can narrow it down. If a client works for a certain company, I don't have to put the company's name. I can just say works for a Fortune 500 company if that's relevant. or works for a graphics company. I only get as specific as needed for the narrative of the session. If it's very important that this person is a graphic designer and they're disappointed in their work and that's part of their stressors for the week, then yeah, it's probably important that I mention that they, you know, have been working on some graphic designs. But if we're just talking about an annoying boss and really what they do is not relevant, then I'm not going to include that information. These are some of the main things that I will always make sure to include and things that I always try to avoid. If you have other ideas or questions, please put them in the comments below. Again, my name is Stephanie It's Anya Buile, Steph Anya for short. I appreciate you for watching until the end of the video. I ask that you like, comment, subscribe, and share this video, especially with someone that could find it useful and might have other ideas for topics for me to cover on this channel. I love to hear your suggestions. Thank you so much again for watching all the way until the end. I appreciate you.